It is a pleasure this afternoon to welcome Dr. Nick Spencer, who is Senior Fellow at Theos. And he is author of a number of books and reports, including The Political Samaritan, How Power Hijacked a Parable, The Evolution of the West, and Atheists, The Origin of Species. Nick is Visiting Research Fellow at the Faiths and Civic Society Unit, Goldsmiths, and a Fellow at the International Society for Science and Religion. He presented a Radio 4 series on the secret history of science and religion, and is the author of Magisteria, The Entangled Stories of Science and Religion, which will be published in spring next year. Nick is well known in Faraday, and we're pleased to host his work on Science and Religion project, which ran from 2019. And Hannah told us some things about that 2 weeks ago. I'm sure he's going to say plenty more about that today. So Nick, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and I'll ask you to take over and give your seminar from NOMA to POMA, the case for overlapping magisteria. Nick.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith, for a kind introduction. It's very nice to be here. When we originally organised this seminar, we didn't know that it would take place on the day that the ONS released the Census 2021 data for religion in Britain. So it's a pleasure to be speaking to you about science and religion rather than the inexorable rise of non-religiosity and the decline of Christianity in the UK. I will be happy to answer questions to that effect afterwards, but maybe we'll keep on science and religion instead. I'm going to talk to you about the background, the project that Hannah and I and Keith have been working on for the last 3 years or so, and start with a recent volume of essays. It was edited by John Milbank and Peter Harrison, entitled After Science and Religion, Fresh Perspectives from Philosophy and Theology, which takes aim at the presuppositions and foundations of so much of what passes for the science and religion debate. You need only to look at the preponderance of books on evolution and religion, or cosmology and religion, or neuroscience and religion to see a pattern emerging. Science discovers something new about the world, religion responds to it. Science acts, religion reacts. This naturally sets up the potential for conflict, and so it's not surprising that it usually gets conflict. The potential is aided and abetted by a particular take on the two categories in question. As Paul Tyson argues in the introduction to the volume, a particular philosophical outlook, analytic philosophy, has tended to dominate contemporary Anglophone science-religion discussion from without. In effect, science and religion are reduced to their alleged propositional content, focused on the nature of the material world, and then turned into competing explanations that are engaged in some kind of zero-sum game. To anyone who knows anything about the history of science and religion, or indeed is seriously engaged in either discipline today, that's a bit of a travesty. NOMA, or non-overlapping magisteria. This position will forever be associated with Stephen Jay Gould, who argued in a 1997 paper and then in his book Rocks of Ages, science documents the factual character of the natural world to develop theories that coordinate and explain these facts, while religion operates in the realm of human purposes, meanings, and values. Or, as he says elsewhere, science asks, what is the universe made of, and why does it work this way? And religion operates in the realm of ultimate meaning and moral value. Therefore, we are told, in the light of that definition, the two are not in conflict because they cannot be in conflict. Now, as I said, there is a certain emotional appeal to this position, if only because Gould himself was a more emollient character than those he opposed, and because his prose is so very readable. However, NOMA seems by popular consent to have a neatness that is bought at the cost of accuracy. Reviewers of his book pointed out that science and religion repeatedly had overlapped. And even if Gould was able to reply that, be that as it may, normatively they shouldn't have done so, still others could point out that there were areas where it was simply impossible to pull them apart normatively rather than descriptively speaking. However, I think Stephen Jay Gould should be given more credit than he often is. let me give an illustration of what I mean. A quick glance at the New Scientist when I was writing this talk gave me these headlines on the front page of the website. NASA's flagship Artemis 1 mission has flown past the moon. UK's quantum computing sector is flourishing after early investment. Australia's first rocket is set to launch into space in April 2023. It's no disrespect to religion to say that it has nothing significant to contribute to these stories, or indeed even the debates that spin off from them. At the same time, a glance at the Church Times gave me the headlines: Manchester Church rises from the ashes, Bishop condemns human rights abuses in China, and put churches to community use if they are to survive, says new research, which happens to come from Theos. I can make the same point here about the irrelevance of science to these stories, although much depends on what we mean by science, and of course religion, and that's something I'll return to. By looking at what in public discourse we naturally slot into these categories, we will find many examples of areas where these magisteria do not overlap. Many examples, but not all. Because at the same time, the New Scientist gave me these headlines. Countries agreed to create climate damage fund in historic COP27 deal. The new pain treatments that may finally stem the need for opioids. Despite reaching 8 billion people, we must plan for population decline. Roger Penrose, quote, consciousness must be beyond computable physics, and a longevity diet that hacks cell aging could add years to your life. While the Church Times gave me these two headlines. At the 23rd hour, COP27 delivers loss and damage fund for vulnerable nations, and ban on choral singing based on flawed evidence, study suggests. Now, quite apart from the fact that both of these illustrious organs contain the same story, climate change, there is quite a lot of overlap here. Climate change is, as I've said, a massive affair, and one that incorporates human behavioural and scientific changes. Interestingly, in the research, the quantitative research that we put into field as part of our Science and Religion project, one of the questions or statements we put to respondents as a measure of measuring their level of scientism was, science is the only thing needed to solve climate change. It's quite a revealing statement if you want to understand people's conception of how important science is. Similarly, what it means to be conscious invites obvious philosophical and theological questions, and issues of longevity, population dynamics, and dealing with pain are all areas where science and religion overlap. And choral singing and the COVID ban would just happen to be the cherry on that particular cake. However much science and religion don't overlap, it's equally clear that they all do. Specifically, they commonly overlap because they both deal with the multi-dimensional question of what it is to be a human being. Part of my argument in this paper is that POMA, partially overlapping magisteria, is a better model than NOMA, and that one of the key areas where science and religion do overlap is with regard to our understanding of the human. To get a better grasp of this argument, we need to turn to the basic question of what science and religion are. Now, Peter Harrison has done us all a great service in his book on the territories of science and religion by reminding us that these terms, like territories, have evolved and changed shape over the centuries. It's an argument that you will be familiar with. Just as the territories over which Israel and Egypt currently exert sovereign political authority existed hundreds of years ago, so did the various activities that now comprise science and religion. Humans have investigated the natural world, rationalized about its processes, weighed evidence, made predictions, and drawn conclusions for centuries. Similarly, we have prayed, worshipped, recited, processed, read, moralized, hoped, and done all the things that would go into the category of religion for even longer. However, just as the boundaries marking out the sovereign territories over which Israel and Egypt did not exist in 1600, so neither did the boundaries of what we currently call science and religion. Hence the opening sentence of Peter's book: if a historian were to contend that he or she had discovered evidence of a hitherto unknown war that had broken out in the year 1600 between Israel and Egypt, this claim would be treated with some skepticism. Peter's book takes aim at the claim that science and religion have been at war historically, but the argument is just as relevant today. Because even though the territories of what we call science and religion were broadly delineated by the end of the 19th century, the point at which Peter's book ends, it would be a mistake to imagine that this kind of political settlement, so to speak, meant that they were clear and well defined today. Problems of boundary delineation, like the poor, will always be with us. The project that we have been working on over the last 3 years seeks to get a better understanding of what science and religion are, or more precisely, how they are used. Because as soon as you ask about the definition of words like science and religion, you end up having to wrestle with the deeper question of according to whom? Whose science and whose religion are you talking about? And asking that question nudges you towards a position most famously articulated by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations, namely that meaning resides in usage. To understand what a word means, you have to listen to how it is used. As Wittgenstein says in section 43 of the philosophical investigation, the meaning of a name is sometimes explained by pointing to its bearer. Or, as he says more bluntly, a few pages later, when talking about how we should define the word game, don't think, but look. Well, we spent an awful lot of time looking, or rather listening, to how people, academics, journalists, the general public, use the word science and the word religion. The result was fascinating and highly complex, and it led us back to Wittgenstein by a second route. Because from the moment we posed the question of what science and religion were, and respondents told us how uncomfortable they were with any such overarching definitions, it became clear that we were not dealing with anything that could be singularly delineated, but rather with what Wittgenstein famously called family resemblances. In his words in Philosophical Investigations, we see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between a member of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. The result of all this is frustrating because it prevents us from saying definitively whether something is in a class or a category or is not. What still counts as a game, which is the example he is talking about in philosophical investigation, what still counts as a game and what no longer does? Can you give a boundary? And his answer to that is simply, no, you can't. Tellingly, this was also the approach adopted by Massimo Pigliucci in his essay in the 2013 book that he co-edited entitled Philosophy of Pseudoscience, Reconsidering the Demarcation Problem, in which he and others started to thaw the problem that Larry Lorden had put into deep freeze a generation earlier with his essay, The Demise of the Demarcation Problem. Pigliucci advocated what he termed the possibility of understanding science as a Wittgenstein-type cluster concept, rather than demanding necessary and sufficient conditions, as had Lorden. Science was better understood in terms of, quote, fuzzy logic and gradual distinctions. We found this encouraging. Effectively, it meant we were on the right track. So what were the family characteristics of science that we found? Well, before I get to that, there's one other point that's well worth mentioning by way of a small but significant caveat. The biologist Jerry Coyne once remarked, "Science operates by using evidence and reason. Doubt is prized, authority rejected. No finding is deemed true, a notion that's always provisional unless it's repeated and verified by others. We scientists are always asking ourselves, how can I find out whether I'm wrong?" Now, what he's doing here is highlighting elements within the disambiguated definition of science that we excavated from our interviewees: method, nature of evidence, epistemic stance, and so forth. But he's also doing something rather subtler that all too often goes unnoticed. It wasn't unnoticed by the primatologist Frans de Waal, however, who quotes Coyne in one of his books and then goes on to remark, "Oh, how I wish I had colleagues like Coyne. Having spent all my life among academics, I can tell you that hearing how wrong they are is about as high on their priority in life as finding a cockroach in their coffee." What this little exchange does is draw out the normative descriptive slippage that all too often works its way into these debates. It was something picked up by some of our interviews, one of whom remarked, "Religion sees itself as being the quest for the truth, whereas science, in its strictest sense, in its Sunday best, as it were, is the quest for provisional understanding which may later be revised." I think that phrase, "in its Sunday best," is a masterpiece. All too often, the science and religion debate compares a normative conception of science, in its Sunday best, as it were, with a descriptive conception of religion, wearing its dirty overalls, so to speak, as it were. In effect, it compares science as it should be with religion as it is, and religion naturally is found wanting and condemned. Needless to say, this is about as fair as comparing an idealized picture of religious belief, devout, loving, generous, self-sacrificial, a kind of living version of the Sermon on the Mount, with the kind of examples of scientific corruption detailed by the investigative science journalist Nicolas Chauvat-Louis in his book Fraud in the Lab. It's simply not a fair like-for-like comparison. We need always to watch out for this normative descriptive slippage when we're dealing with definitions. So, what were our definitions? How did people use and understand the words science and religion? Well, necessarily in brief, not only because this is a short seminar, but because this is also very much still a work in progress, and limiting ourselves to the expert interviews we conducted, 101 interviews with scientists and philosophers and sociologists of science and so on and so forth. Our interviewees disaggregated science into 6 dimensions. By that, I obviously mean that our analysis of what they said identified what we judged to be 6 different areas. These were the methods of science, the subjects of science, the presuppositions of science, the objectives of science, the values of science, and the institutional structures of science. To take each in turn briefly. The idea that science could be defined and distinguished by the scientific method was the most widely discussed definitional element within all our interviews. However, at the same time, the idea that there was such a thing as the scientific method was treated in much the same way as the idea that there was such a thing as science. There were different elements or sub-branches within this particular methodological definition or dimension. The methods of science involved forming questions, hypotheses, conceptual models, and or theories. These hypotheses and theories were testable, and ideally they were refutable. The testing of these hypotheses was grounded in a particular set of rules or practices or methods. Commitment to these rules, and especially those of experimentation, was paralleled by an equal commitment to quantification and to accuracy. And all these methodological factors were also characterized by the provisional nature of science and an epistemic humility that could sometimes be seen in the cognizance of science's limitations. All that was hoovered up simply in the first dimension, which is the method of science. When it came to the subject of science, it was clear from everyone we spoke to that the subject of science was limited, but quite how it was limited was highly contestable. We were told that it was limited to understanding nature, or the natural world, or the physical world, or the material world, or more precisely, how the world functions at a materialistic level. Alternatively, it was a way of understanding the external world, or the observable world, or the world to which we have common access. But needless to say, time and again, there were tensions that emerged here, tensions about the silent elision of material, physical, and natural, about the theoretically observable reality that was engaged by some physicists. There were tensions about the naturalness of the social world that was interrogated by social and economic scientists. And then there were tensions about the sheer non-materiality of the world that mathematicians worked on. Science, it was broadly agreed, should be and was characterized by its subjects in as far that it was about some things and not about other things. It's just no one could agree on what. Thirdly, there were the presuppositions of science. Science could not operate without a pre-scientific commitment to the patterns or the regularities or the lawfulness of the reality that it was studying. It could not operate without the conviction that the universe was intelligible, or put another way, that the evolved human brain was cognitively capable of grasping the truth about reality. And it could not operate without a prior commitment to the existence of the external world and to the reliability of human senses. Fourth, science had its objectives. Now, interviewees sometimes paid lip service to the idea that science was the disinterested investigation of reality, but most, and especially those who had spent a lifetime working in science, recognized that this was basically a fiction. Science was ideally predictive. It was cumulative, and it was very frequently tied up with a human endeavor to control, to modify, and to improve the material world. And of course, it was funded as well. And we'll come back to that when we get to the institutional nature of science. Before that, the fifth area was the values of science. Just as science needs certain pre-scientific metaphysical assumptions to work, so it also needs pre-scientific moral assumptions to do so. Humility and intellectual modesty were amongst those most mentioned. But then there was also curiosity, self-discipline, self-criticism, and honesty, as well as, mentioned by some of our interviewees, imagination and creativity. Without these, science could simply not get off the ground. Lastly, but definitely not least, there was the institutional nature of science. Science is a social activity, a collaborative social exercise through which we are able to establish agreed knowledge. Crucially, however, this collaboration is formalized or institutionalized, and this institutionalization manifests itself in a number of ways, such as in the specific institutions and organizations within which scientists work, in the sense of belonging to a wider community of scientists, which institutionalizes people through norms and practices around things like papers, peer reviews, journals, and conferences. and with regard to distinctive scientific language and structures of authority. One of our respondents put it along the lines of someone fiddling with things at the end of their shed, in their shed at the end of their garden is not doing science, however brilliant he or she may be. The scientist invariably must exist within a network, a web of collaborative scientists. Now, this is a long list, and to be honest with you, I've only really skimmed over it. It's going to be given in a great deal more detail in a monograph that we're producing for the project. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, I don't have time to go into anything like as much detail when we get to the disambiguated understanding of religion. Suffice it to say, our analysis drew out 5 dimensions of religion, although even just saying that, I'm acutely conscious of the absolutely titanic academic and legal literature on this matter, which makes me aware how many different ways there are of cutting this particular cake. We termed our dimensions the transcendence of religion, the belief of religion, the commitment of religion, the formalization of religious belief, and the formalization of religious commitment. And respectively, these encompassed the existence of God, or a supernatural element, or unseen forces of some kind, or a higher power, entities or forces greater than the individual human being, or imagined reality. The language was exceptionally fluid here, but also usually the active interest, personal involvement, and even intervention of that transcendent reality into our own. Secondly, with regard to belief, it involved the consideration of the cognitive and epistemological bases and processes by means of which humans came to have the conviction of the existence of that transcendent realm. The very fact that faith has become a cipher for religion in contemporary public discourse is an indication of the fact that the processes and bases and epistemological stance of that belief is itself a focus of what it is. Thirdly, with regard to commitment, religion was broadly termed to be more than just a cognitive assent, but it was personal, ethical, material, and bodily commitment to that reality. Fourthly, it involved the formalization of beliefs in terms of the development of theology and the codification of dogma and doctrine. And fifthly, it involved the collectivization and formalization of those commitments in terms of collective rituals, ceremonies, laws, hierarchies, offices, institutions, and the like. Now, to be absolutely clear, the nature of the family resemblance approach to this definitional question means that none of these dimensions outlined can be considered necessary or sufficient to our understanding of science or religion. The whole point of the family resemblances approach is that the logic is fuzzy. Rather, what we have is a series of complex, splintered, overlapping understandings of science and of religion, some of which are such that they will involve the legitimate overlap of science and religion. They will partially overlap. Which? Well, as I said, this is a work in progress, and I don't want to extend this paper longer than I already have, but in our initial report, we focused on 6 areas in which the two entities, for want of a better word, did overlap. These were epistemological, relating to the question of how we know, what we think we know, metaphysics, hermeneutics, anthropology, ethics, and politics. Dozens of overlapping questions spin off from underneath each of these titles. So, for example, regarding the first, what evidence is admissible in these discussions? To what extent does personal experience constitute legitimate evidence? What epistemological status does revelation have? What role does authority have in the evaluation of evidence? And so on and so forth. Or with regarding hermeneutics, how does the use of language in scientific and religious contexts or games differ? I was struck by the fact when I interviewed her a couple of years ago, Janet Soskis, who wrote a very fine book on metaphor and religious language, which was based on her PhD in the 1980s, remarked that when she embarked on it, the only person she could find sympathetic to her subject was someone in the science faculty who was writing on metaphor and science language. Those kind of conversations are fruitful, but they're also, I think, infrequent, or at least they certainly were then. Do we judge metaphorical language in science different from metaphorical language in religion? Is it possible, as I put it to one of our interviewees, to take something seriously without taking it literally? And of course, anthropology, to take a third of the 6 we listed there, but to return to where I started this talk. What is the relationship between our various understandings of the human, whether genetic, evolved, biological, relational, social, spiritual? Which, if any of these levels, merits precedence over the others, and in which circumstances? Is dialogue possible between these different levels of anthropological understanding, or are the different levels fundamentally incommensurable? To pick up on some of the headlines early on, how best should we understand questions of consciousness or longevity or population dynamics or pain, or indeed climate change? These are all areas where there is overlap between the 2 magisteria, but not, I would emphasize, the kind of overlap that Paul Tyson and others rightly bemoaned in After Science and Religion. This isn't a zero-sum competitive explanation kind of an overlap, but at least in the case of anthropology, a multi-dimensional, or better still, multi-level understanding of being human, which naturally overlaps with other understandings of being human, but not in a narrowly competitive way. And it's one, particularly with regard to anthropology, that I think is only going to grow with importance, because as Hannah and I are exploring in a different forthcoming book, which draws on the project, so many of the key questions of tomorrow will result from science moving on to ever more anthropological territory. Will AI merit the same recognition we afford to humans? Where would the science of extreme life extension take our conception of human life and human good? What does the growing movement, often driven by zoological and especially primatological studies, to recognize the personhood of non-human animals, what would that say about human dignity or uniqueness? How far should we seek to treat sadness pharmacologically? And what would we think of ourselves if the search for extraterrestrial intelligence actually connected the goods? These are all areas where science and religion do overlap, although, to repeat, not in an unhelpful zero-sum competitive way. We need to make sure that we can draw on all the intellectual resources available to us to tackle them, and that means those afforded by both science and religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for a fascinating talk, and they've introduced lots of things to us. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. I remind people to put the questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. There's one question that asks how this work relates to particularly the work of Jonathan Sacks in his book.
That's a really good question. I reviewed Jonathan Sacks's book a number of years ago. I don't know is the short answer, because I've forgotten what Jonathan Sacks wrote, but except for the fact he had this fascinating illustration about how, if I remember it rightly, and the questioner, I'd be grateful the questioner came in because they may have a better recollection of it than I do. Sacks had this brilliant point about how Hebrew, because it is a language without vowels, requires readers to understand entire words, entire sentences, in order to get the meaning of them. In other words, to get a meaning of a Hebrew sentence, I think I'm right in saying you need to understand all the words in context. And so it naturally orients you to a more holistic approach to grasping truth. Whereas in English, for example, it is easier to get an understanding of words mean by isolating them from their context. And I think Sachs goes on to draw the conclusion that this is quite a good illustration of the different ways in which religion and science engage with grasping the truth about the world. In other words, science is very good at splitting things up, isolating A from B, trying to understand what A does, what B does, and then putting them back together again. Whereas religion invites people to understand things more holistically, which I guess is also keys into the relevant idea of emergence and the idea that you can only understand some phenomena in their more holistic emergent form. Now, I think what I've said would fit in with that quite nicely in two ways, partly because the idea that the Wittgensteinian idea, which I based the stuff on, that language resides, the meaning of language resides in usage, is naturally fits into that Sachs picture. In other words, it demands that you understand things embedded in a holistic way to get an understanding of them. But it probably also keys into the whole idea of there being an epistemological overlap in a science and religion discussion, because there is a perfectly legitimate question around how do you get to know things, and is the approach of pulling things apart in order to reassemble them the best or even the only approach to getting to know things. So I think, although I see my memory of Sachs is a bit shaky at the moment, I think it would work in parallel with Jonathan Sachs. And also just saying that, then it would probably also work in parallel with Ian McGilchrist's work on the different ways of attention that the left and the right hemisphere of the brain pay to reality, and the way in which that then results in different understandings, different almost ontologies of reality.
Excellent, thank you. That's a very detailed answer when you said you couldn't remember much about what Jonathan Sachs had written. Thank you, Nick. Here's another question, rather different one. Emil Durkheim observed that all religions separate the sacred and the profane, and they all have sacred values. Is this a useful way of seeing things? It follows there will therefore always be a conflict between science and religion, where free inquiry is turned to the issues which society holds to be sacred, otherwise known as taboos.
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? So I think this is one of those things that without realizing it, can slip into this normative descriptive error that I mentioned earlier. So I could see how an answer to that question is yes, because science is predicated on burrowing around and getting to the root of things, whereas as Durkheim said, there is always going to be an element in religion which preserves the sacred. There's going to be a holy of holies, and if you ignore that, you know, you're going to be ostracized. Effectively, you're going to be excommunicated, metaphorically. And certainly that was at the heart of the Victorian, near the heart of the Victorian crisis of faith. Nothing to do with science, but due to the fact that German higher criticism started treating texts that Protestants had heretofore considered sacred as if they were just normal texts, which could be analysed with the same tools that any criticism applied to text. And that scandalised a lot of the Protestant thinkers. So the potential there is, the potential is certainly there. But I think that, as I said, that falls into the normative descriptive mistake, because it for a start, imagines that all scientific processes are always going to be busily engaged in the question of doubting that which has been held sacred beforehand. And we know that isn't the case. I go back to the France de Waal and Jerry Coyne exchange. But also, I think it is a myth to see all religions necessarily as preserving a kind of a core of sacredness, which they never dare to go near. You only have to look at Christianity in the last 150 years in the West to know that there are plenty of people who have been thoroughly acquainted with sociology of religion and the anthropology of religion, the hermeneutics of religion, and yet you still retain religious belief. So that's quite possible. But also, I guess I would go back to a lot of the narratives in the Hebrew scriptures where lead figures, most obviously Moses, argue with God. And I think there's quite a good model there within the Christian scriptures, and particularly in the Hebrew scriptures, whereby serious belief demands serious struggling, serious wrestling with God, rather than holding something so sacred that you don't go anywhere near it. I'm not denying that there is a dimension of the sacred there, but I don't think it comes at the cost of never being able to question it, never being able to interrogate it. So I think there's the potential for attention there, but I don't think it's necessary.
Thank you. Here's a rather different question that comes from a member of the Faraday Youth and Schools team. You described science to us as provisional and the way in which it can be sometimes enthusiastically disproved. They said that school science is a long way from that sort of science. Can you comment on that? You think why it is, and how can that gap be closed?
I mean, it's a very good point. I've made this point once or twice when using the Coyne quote and saying science is all about questioning, endlessly doubting. It's somewhat ironic and possibly hypocritical to make that statement when you're standing in a laboratory, when you're standing in a lecture hall. In other words, when you have a figure of authority up the front who is educating massed ranks of students in front of them, rather than them engaged in the act of interrogation. There is an inherent element of authority and conveying facts, particularly when teaching science. Having said that, and I think this is the message underlying the question, I suspect, and in fact I know this really from my own kids' experience, that kind of science communication is a bit of a passion killer. And actually it is the getting one's sleeves rolled up and doing it that ignites interest. This is way above my pay grade. I didn't do science A-level, let alone advising people how to teach science. So take this, advice with a pinch of salt or more than that. But it strikes me that if that is genuinely the case, the more one does it, the better response one would get from students. I'm conscious that that may not be what you need to hear if you want to pass a GCSE in these basic subjects, but it does seem to me that if this, if the USP, unique selling point of science, is this rolling my sleeves up and actually questioning, doing the stuff myself, the more of it that I do, the more enthusiastic about it I'll be.
Thank you. Here's a more philosophical question. Is that Gould's NOMA proposal begins to make historical sense in the specific context of 19th century Roman Catholic understanding of magisterium, with a healthy sense of perspective that religion is not one of the three theological virtues or four cardinal virtues, but only one part of the moral virtues. To what extent do you think your POMA proposal is simply a recovery of a healthy sense of Catholicity?
Well, I'm tempted to say yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's it will be very clear that this is only a kind of half worked through proposal, and I'm not kind of ashamed of that, because as I said right at the beginning, it is what's work in progress. And the challenge this will always face is that metaphors work best in terms of getting public attention when they're simplest. And the point about this entire debate is that we're saying that there is no single simple metaphor that does capture everything we're trying to say. You know, John Henry Brooke famously talked about complexity thesis, but then said, you know, well, I'd rather talk about complexity, but said it's not a thesis, it's just a description of the way things are. And Peter's point about territories is it is a single metaphor, but it's quite a flexible metaphor. I think, you know, POMA is not an attractive phrase by any means. I mean, virtually nobody knows what NOMA means. So POMA is even more about hiding nothing like that. But in as far as it is an attempt to draw the conversation back, draw the debate or the argument into a series of healthier conversations about a much wider range of topics that have hitherto occupied at least, you know, the headlines when it comes to science and religion. I would hope it is a healthy step in that direction. Now, whether that's quite the same Catholicity as the questioner was referring to, I don't know, but I think it's in the same direction.
Thank you. In your description of science, one of the things you said, it is funded. And the question occurs to me as to who does the funding and who says what should be funded, and whether religion or science or atheism or whatever has the final say in that. If you want to do research in this country, it has to line up with one of the grand challenges. Who says what those should be?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very hot topic. And I guess it's probably important to draw out the fact that, you know, not all science funding is equal here. So, you know, the science funding required for CERN is different from the science funding required for medical trials. I guess I would have to kind of kick the question into the long grass slightly by saying that one of the 6 dimensions we put out from the report where there is overlap is politics. And I think this is a relatively ignored area, at least in popular discourse of science and religion. But we were put onto it by John Evans in the US, and a professor in San Diego in the US, who's written a book called Morals, Not Knowledge. And effectively his point is that most people in the US, they don't fixate on the kind of issues, epistemological or metaphysical issues that the elite do when it comes to science and religion, but they do worry about things like euthanasia and abortion and that kind of stuff. And actually, most people encounter the science and religion debate through what they see on their TV screens. And they're often stories about the moral implications of science or the political ramifications of it. And so nobody we spoke to, I think, advocated a kind of a purist view, which is that, you know, science research has to be pure, and therefore, you know, it's the money it receives, the funding it receives, is completely independent from the considerations, practical political considerations. But at the same time, they were very nervous about commercial capture, if I can put it that way. So I guess it's a midway between recognizing that there is a political dimension to funding, and therefore that is a dimension which anybody, including religious people, have a say in, but that at the same time, the practice of science couldn't be entirely dictated by public considerations of what was fundable.
Thank you. Here's a different one again. Rather than saying that these things have an untouchable sacred core, may it not be more helpful to think in terms of multiple levels of interpreting reality?
I mean, yes, I think I can be a bit more succinct with that one. The multi-layer or multi-level point is one I have a great deal of sympathy with. I mentioned it a few times in the talk. It does depend what dimension you're talking about, but specifically when you're talking about human beings, the idea that there are different equally legitimate ways of understanding the human, I think is very profitable. And just having finished the book on the history of science and religion, it struck me very clearly that the greatest points of tension there were between science and religion over the years have not even been when science and religion, very broad categories, have had different views of the human, but when they have treated those views as exclusive. So the French church in the 18th century saying, effectively banning biology because it's seen as a threat to the idea of the human soul. Or evolutionary biologists in the late 19th, early 20th century getting their entire understanding of the human simply through science. When you have exclusive understanding, single level understandings of the human, that's when the potential arises. So yes, the multi-layer, multi-level approach, I think, is much more profitable.
Thank you. Here's a question. Is it a defensible stance to take that the 6 characteristics of science that you suggested are all derived from a Christian worldview anyway? And how did your interviewees justify those characteristics?
I don't quite follow about whether derived from a Christian worldview. I mean, it's probably worth saying that of our interviewees, we deliberately went for an irreligious bunch, if I can put it that way. The original framing of the project was wanting to understand what the problem was, effectively, when people perceive the problems in science and religion. And if you're going to do that, you're going to want people who think there is a problem. So we had an interview sample that was disproportionately atheistic, disproportionately not religious, although there were some religious people in there, but not just Christians. There were some Jewish scientists and some Muslim scientists as well. I don't think we had any non-Abrahamic religions. So I'm not quite sure that I see the kind of Christian link there. Yeah, I mean, maybe the question might want to elaborate that.
Okay, we might come back on that one if we've time. Religion, the term you used, is itself a rather vague and slippery term, as you've described. Would it be better to phrase the discussion in terms of between science and theology, like between 2 academic disciplines, rather than with religion?
It simply would have been a different project then, I guess. I mean, it's striking that the 2 big tones that set up the narrative of the history of science and brackets, choose term here, are Draper's John William Draper in 1874, the history of the war of science and religion, and White's in 1896, the history of the warfare of science and theology in Christendom, and choose different terms. One chooses religion, the other chooses theology. But faith would have been the 3rd term one could use. Religion is, I guess, the most familiar term people use. It's the most encompassing terms. I think if you're having a discussion about religion, you can legitimately, in fact, we did have discussions about faith and about theology. Whereas if you're having specifically a discussion about science and faith or science and theology, it's harder to have one about religion. So in a sense, religion is the atrium for this entire debate. And I think that as long as you engaged in precisely what we did do, which was disambiguating the term and understanding that there is a theological dimension to religion and exploring what that then says about science and theology, I think it's fine. But it seems to me that, for better or worse, both science and religion are just the go-to terms in this debate. So you might as well start where people are already talking.
Thank you. I think our time is almost up, so I'll draw our questions to a close there. Thank you, Nick, for really a brilliant talk and for the wide way in which you answered so many diverse questions. showing the breadth of your knowledge and the things that you discovered from your interviews. So thank you very much for talking to us this afternoon, and thank you to everybody for the questions.